I'm going to start the recording.
Great.
Take it away.
Okay. And Sue, are you also going to drop in the chat the video from the first session in case people missed that?
I will. I have to retrieve it, so I'll have to minimize my
Okay,
screen.
it'll come eventually.
It'll come.
Take your time.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you again for coming. This was a joint program by Wright County Indivisible and Plymouth Area Indivisible. And we have an enormous amount of territory to cover. So I'm going to turn it right over to our guest speaker, Paul Huffman. Take it away, Paul. You're not muted, are you? Yes, you are.
Oh, he is. I can't.
Paul, you should be able to unmute yourself.
He's looking frozen on my screen.
He needs to Paul, can you unmute yourself?
He is frozen, Susan.
Frozen. Okay.
Does he need to sign out and come back?
Does he need to come?
Okay, I
sign
am
up?
back.
Oh, you're there?
You can't hear me. I said, welcome, Paul. Would you take it away for us now?
All right, yeah, I had to, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I dropped off for there a moment. I've switched over to a hotspot. That's kind of my backup from a technology standpoint. Anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity. Again, if at some point you're not hearing me okay, then we'll let me know. What I'm going to do, again, my name is Paul Huffman. I'm the redistricting coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota. And what I'm going to talk about this evening is local redistricting. And this is building on what I talked about last week about redistricting from a bigger picture standpoint, really focusing on local government and then local action. And since the primary group that I was talking with here is Wright County, I'm focusing on Wright County, but a lot of this is applicable to other groups as well. So I'll share my screen there. And what I'm going to do is just save bandwidth. I'm just going to turn off my camera, just to save bandwidth because you can hear me, but you don't need to see me while all this is going on. With the League of Women Voters, and I said it last weekend, but if there's folks here who were not here last week, just a reminder that we are a nonpartisan organization. We don't support or oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. But we are always working on issues that are of concern to our members and the public. What this does mean is that there are frequently occasions where we will take a principled stand on a policy of some sort that can be perceived as partisan because those policies do become partisan in nature with one party or the other. And frequently there's partisan actions that are taken. Now, in the case of local government, those are nonpartisan positions, but that doesn't mean that elected officials don't have specific policy interests that they may be representing or advancing. And it also doesn't mean that there can't be actions taken by local elected officials to manipulate district results or do it in a way that isn't responsive and reflective of the will of the people. So part of what we talk about here is in a local context, how does redistricting work? And many of the same concepts about criteria, participation, public involvement that applies at the state level. I just want to throw this up momentarily from a standpoint of and, ensuring that we revisit the schedule. What this shows is the schedule going out. And I just want to focus at the very end of this, which is census block data gets received in September. In February, the Supreme Court likely issues a final redistricting order. And then local redistricting is done really, and there's about 6 weeks for the cities to do their redistricting. And then there's the additional 2 weeks additional 4 weeks approximately for the counties to do theirs. I just will note in Wright County, I looked, there are no cities in Wright County that actually have wards. About 10% of Minnesota cities, 800 cities, about 80 of them have wards or districts in them. So, it's kind of unusual that county that doesn't have any of them. Anyway, this is the time frame we're looking at. But at the same time, if you look back at my timeline, this fall is the time when city and county governments ought to be deciding how they're going to conduct that. And then if we bring back a little further, is now's an opportunity to start reaching out to your elected leaders and find out, what their plans are. Just one thing I want to, just reinforce is that I talked about last week is about why is redistricting important? And especially when you're talking with local counties or cities, if you're from outside of Wright County, that it's about community representation and what are the needs of the community, and therefore what voices are heard and the policy interests are served. Now you look at Wright County, you've got a variety of cities, you've got industrial activities in various areas, you've got a lot of agricultural area. And so how are those different interests being represented and how are they being divided up into those county commissioner districts? And so then it's a matter of what voices are getting heard. And if you get a city or a community that's divided up in between a number of different representatives, then those voices are less likely to be heard. And especially for local politics, it's around policies and not party, because you don't have a party ostensibly. The focus on local redistricting, why do we suggest people focus on that? The first of all is it provides individuals and community groups with an opportunity to engage and act within their community. I think a lot of us, it's somewhat simple to act at the state level, to contact our legislators, to send questions, to even to provide testimony. And those bills are very visible a lot of times. So that's something that it's a lot of structure to help with that. But the reality is that change comes slowly and seldom, infrequently at a state level. But at the local level, there's a lot more immediacy. You know who your representatives are. You know how to contact them. There are people in your community. And if you're involved in government on a regular basis, you know who they are and they may know who you are. So there's a lot more opportunity to make an impact. It's also about emphasizing community voices. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is communities of interest. And the reason for that is we think it's probably not realistic to think that too many of us are going to be able to draw district maps locally or at a state level. It's very complicated, a lot of things to consider. But what we all can do is think about what is our community? What is the interest that we have in policy that defines us geographically? And those are things that we can identify and communicate both to our local representatives at the city or county level, and then at the legislators from a state standpoint, so they consider those inputs when drawing maps. This is an opportunity to engage people in action that's likely to result in immediate and observable results. We can work a lot at the state level and not see any real results, but at the local level, there's a greater opportunity for that. The other thing I'll mention is that there's a lot of funding, a lot of activities, and I mentioned this last week, that happens at the city and county level. And so when people look at how to make policy changes, when you think about transit, you think about public safety, you think about healthcare, you think about infrastructure, zoning, development, those are all local items, cities or county items. And so there's opportunities to make an impact and really be involved locally on those issues. And then it helps with learning the role of local government, what they do and what maybe they should do. So those are the reasons we suggest people focus on local redistricting. The same things that we do locally can scale up and be impactful and meaningful at a state level as well to local legislators who are then inputting to whatever their legislative committees are doing. The local redistricting, what I do is talk about, I talked about it's done after the legislative maps are drawn. And once the maps are drawn in mid-February, the first thing that happens is that precinct boundaries are drawn. Cities and towns, and then for unincorporated areas, the county will draw any ward boundaries or precinct boundaries, for elections. That governs how the precincts and elections are set up. And by state law, no legislative or congressional boundary can go across precinct boundaries. So wherever those new legislative lines get drawn, precincts have to be drawn in such a way that they fall entirely within a specific legislative district. For any government entity and counties for everybody, cities in some examples, it's required that there be redistricting. And I'll go through some of the, for city counties, I'll go through the specific requirements. There's not quite as many requirements for cities, but I'll talk through that a little bit for cities as well, for those who may have an interest in that. And then a process. I think it's important, and said it last week, just like the legislature, you get the people who are in the office are the ones who draw the boundaries, and they have a vested interest in how those boundaries get drawn. They do understand what their constituents think, but a lot of constituents aren't really engaged in local redistricting. And so again, this is an opportunity for engagement, for transparency, visibility, making an input, and understanding how those decisions are being made. From a city standpoint, same thing. City councils generally do this. The one exception I know of is Minneapolis, where the Charter Commission does the redistricting. But so that's something where, if you are in a city that does redistricting, has wards, or you can reach out to me and I can validate that and work with you. Then you got to look at your, city statutes and look at your city charter and what that says. So for county redistricting, what's the requirements? Well, first of all, counties must redistrict by state law if any county commissioner or district boundaries are no longer on precinct or ward boundaries. So county commissioner boundaries also have to follow precinct boundaries, and they have to follow ward boundaries within cities. If any county commissioner district for some reason is no longer continuous, what that means is if the district varies in population by more than 10% from the average. And I mentioned last week that there's been a lot of population variation. And that's something the county commissioners are going to have to look at when the census data comes in to see if there is greater than 10% variation between the districts. There's some requirements about, the majority of the least populous districts being less than the majority of the population. There are some places where, again, across the state, there is an increasing concentration of population in the urban or city areas. I mean, I know in Wright County, you don't have big cities, but the cities are tending to become more populous than the rural areas. And the commission of districts, if they're not as equal as possible, that is another reason to potentially redistrict. So those are things that would require them to do redistricting. That doesn't mean counties can't decide to do redistricting, even if that wasn't the case, but that's when they must do redistricting. So once they do redistricting, there's a variety of requirements. These are the key requirements that counties have to meet. First of all, they have to give 3-week notice that they're going to do redistricting. So there's some notice requirement. Each county is divided in as many districts as there are members of the Board of Commissioners. In Wright County, you've got 5 commissioners, and counties in Minnesota vary from 3 to 7 commissioners. The commissioner districts are bounded by precinct lines, which may also correspond with town, municipal, and ward boundaries. So if you think about it, the legislative boundaries bound precinct lines, cities bound precinct lines. So to a great extent, commissioner districts are going to follow precinct line, precinct as well as town and municipal boundaries. Contiguous territory. There's a requirement in statute that they are as regular and compact in form as practicable. So, and compactness is something that, is basically a geometric definition. The most compact shape is a circle. You can have something that looks really pretty, but it may not be a really good district because it may not represent the right populations of people and the right interests. And then district populations can't vary by more than 10% from the average. And some greater variations allowed in counties, because if you think about it, they got smaller populations in counties, and therefore it's harder when you have to follow precinct lines and town boundaries. It's hard to get as close as you can with like legislative or congressional boundaries. Just a model of a map just to show where we are. If you think about big picture, I talked about this last week. It was blown up a little bit, looking at all the different legislative districts in Wright County. You see, you've got 5 different House districts. I think I missed one of them last time. 15B comes down here in the northwest part of Wright County. But then you've got 29A, 29B, 18A is down here. You got a little bit of 30B over here. So, and I talked last time about, how a lot of the urban districts, so down southeast of you, Hennepin County, the western suburbs, those have become more densely populated. The places to the northwest of you have become less densely populated. So these boundaries are going to move. So then it's a matter of, and I'm not saying these existing boundaries are bad. They may actually put communities together that have similar interests up in the northwest part of Wright County, and then the south, this kind of northeast part of Wright County. Those may have similar interests. Those may make sense. But then it's a matter of being intentional and having input to your representatives about what it is you're looking for. And then from a county standpoint, and a lot of county websites have very nice maps, and Wright County is no different. And I apologize for the residual Rochester and Olmsted County data over there. The districts should be pretty close in population. I said they have to be within 10%. And that tells you that up there to the northeast, Otsego, Albertville, St. Michael area is more populated. It's along I-94, a lot more development, a lot more suburban sprawl. Then up going through Monticello, and I used to spend a lot of time in Monticello when I was working. And then down in Buffalo. So those are some of the smaller districts, areas that are more rural, like in District 5 down there, District 4, going to be bigger areas. So those are things that, depending on what development's been in the last 10 years, and you're closer than I am, if there's been more population growth in the District 3, that may now be combined with effects of District 5, you may have greater than 10% variation. So those district lines are going to be redrawn. And so there's an opportunity for public input on that. So just to keep in your mind that those are what your current districts are, drawn in a way to tie places together. So here you got District 1 ties together, Annandale and Buffalo. Those are pretty far apart, but that may make sense for you. That District 5 is a lot of smaller townships, a lot more rural. So something to look at is what's going to make sense for you in Wright County from a district standpoint. Well, I want to share some things that are good practices in local redistricting, and this applies to cities as well as counties. And these are things that a variety of places do. Establishing criteria for local redistricting through a county commissioner resolution or ordinance. There are counties, the county I'm in, Washington County in 2011 did establish a resolution for criteria for redistricting. So I think that's a good practice, and they've done that. And they're not the only county. I've heard some other counties have done that. Including communities of interest as one of those. And I talk about communities of interest, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, about what they are and why they matter. Because a lot of times we have trouble defining what's important to us. Again, we kind of revert to Republicans and Democrats as a surrogate for talking about policy. But again, when we're talking about nonpartisan seats in city councils, county commissioners, it's really talking about policy interests, and are those policy interests being represented? Provide public opportunity for public input. Some counties do this well, some don't. And this depends somewhat on what is the interest level and the expectation of the voters. If there are highly engaged citizens that are asking and expecting to have an opportunity for input, then you're more likely to have that. For county commissioners, this is not something they do very often. It's not something they're very good at. And they're probably wanting to just do it and move on to other more important things around infrastructure and public safety and so on. But it's really important for how voices get heard and policy gets made in the county. So it's important to ask them to make sure there's an opportunity for public input, not just hearings, but input for maps before they start drawing maps. Include scheduling public meetings. Consider getting a portal or on the website or some email option to submit maps or inputs for redistricting in the county. Same thing goes for cities. And we've asked, and one of our county commissioners here in Washington County has said they're going to pursue getting a portal or a link on the website so we can provide inputs on maps. Make sure those public meetings are scheduled to review process and criteria. That's an opportunity this coming fall, is to have an opportunity to talk about how that process is going to work and what is the process for public input and what principles, what rules is the county commission going to use to make those decisions. There is an option in law for the county commission to establish an advisory commission. It's required if those districts are challenged in court and overturned in court. I haven't heard of any counties that do that on their own, but it is something out there in law and the guidance from the state that says that counties may do it. Allow adequate time for public review and comment. I talked to one county where the county commissioners had a meeting one night, had public comment, the next day they issued the maps. They had a meeting for transparency. They met the letter of the law, but they really didn't meet the spirit. It wasn't real public input. It wasn't real public review. And it wasn't true transparency. So you have asked for and expect true transparency in that. And then make sure they incorporate the public comment into creating the final maps. So that's the true sign of responsiveness and transparency and public engagement. So those are some things to think about. These mimic some of the things that we talk about at the state level for redistricting, on a local level. And it's things that might not be that hard for local governments, county commissioners to do. It does take additional time. I will also note that usually the person who is most knowledgeable about how redistricting is done is not the county commissioner. It's going to be folks in the county staff, the county administrator, or some other county staff member who may be the one who has facilitated or run that process in the past. So it's important to ask the question early to the county commissioners and then get some other input from them. One of the things I talk about is communities of interest, and I didn't really talk about this last week because it gets a little bit complicated. But once you get past some of the initial thoughts, this is a generic term that's used in kind of the elections and democracy world. A community of interest refers to a group of people in a geographic or contiguous area with a common set of concerns that may be affected by legislation. So it includes ethnic, racial, and economic groups. Some examples, racial, ethnic background, history or culture, religion or language, socioeconomic status. Some other things, transportation patterns, economic ties, communication networks, media markets. So those are some things to think about. It's got to be able to be mapped, and it's got to have some consistent policy interest. A lot of times it does line up along racial ethnic boundaries, grounds, but it could align around, for example, I said last week, agriculture or mining or tourism could be a good one, or a certain type of industry, whether it's manufacturing or whether it's meat packing, for example, in the southwest part of the state is a very specific economic interest in that area. So that's some of the ways to think about this. One of the things that we've had a discussion about how to map these, and I'll talk a little about a tool to map communities here in a couple of minutes. Is sometimes what happens is that groups are kind of dispersed through an area. So we talk about racial or ethnic background. We talk about in some communities or some jurisdictions, finding a way to get representation for, and looking at Rochester's about 28% non-white. And so we started looking at, okay, but there's no representation in the city council. Could the wards be drawn in a way to represent that? And it turns out that the population is pretty well distributed through Rochester. So there's not a good Rochester City Council that represents that particular community. But now if we start looking at socioeconomic status, you start looking at maybe where are there are more affordable housing areas, where are there people that are more working class areas. And now that starts aligning with some specific policy interests around economics, probably around housing, probably around services. And that then helps get at the policy interest without relying on racial or ethnic background. And so it's another way, and maybe a better way to me, of looking at how to map our communities and what's important to us as we get a little more integrated. We do have a preferred definition for our alliance. I'm part of League of Women Voters. We're part of the Our Maps Minnesota campaign. Minnesota Indivisible is part of the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy, as we are, and we have been working on proposed legislation on redistricting. And in that, we do have a proposed definition for communities of interest, and this aligns pretty well with that standard definition, being a community of interest, including racial, ethnic, or linguistic group, or any group with shared experiences and concerns, including but not limited to geographic, government, regional, social, cultural, historic, socioeconomic, occupational, trade, or transportation interests. Yes, it's consistent with some other states and what's in their laws. But I'll just share that, and I will share these slides after the fact so this can be available. When it says at the bottom here is communities of interest don't include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or candidates, because again, we're trying to draw representative districts for communities and cities and people based on policy interest, not political identity. And so because, as I said last week, and I say consistently, policy interests can change between communities and parties. One of the things that we talk about is, and I drew this to help people with, we define a community of interest. You draw a map of an area that is a certain community with a certain set of policy interests. What do I do with that? And the way we were approaching redistricting, and really it's a grassroots bottom-up approach to redistricting, is that those community of interest maps can go many places. They are input to local legislators for redistricting committees in the legislature. They are potential input to legislative hearings through testimony to make sure that the maps, if they one of the chambers of the legislature is talking about maps, you can provide testimony based on those communities. Potentially inputs a special redistricting panel when that meets coming this fall, which I'm sure they will. It's a potential input to the Supreme Court, specifically if there's something very specific that you feel needs to be represented that is not being captured by the special redistricting panel. You can take those maps and you can present them to the Supreme Court through testimony or a brief or something of that nature. It's input to the city and county officials for local maps. and we talked to is we're going to take all those community of interest maps that get developed through our Maps Minnesota campaign, and we're going to roll those up to a parallel commission that will separately provide input to the special redistricting panel, to the legislature, and to the courts, which will say, based on all these inputs of the communities and other factors which we've identified through our partners, these are what the best maps are for the people of Minnesota. And so we talked last week about a little bit about why not let computers draw the maps? Well, because the computers know the numbers and they know the demographics and they can know some things about economics, but they aren't going to understand what people really care about. And so to understand what people really care about, then we need to have those inputs to the parallel commission, and then have that integrated together to give to the people drawing the maps. And ultimately, our view is the ideal is that you take those community maps, you give them to an independent commission. That independent commission decides what the maps are for the state. So this tells you that there's a lot of utility, a lot of value in understanding communities, understanding what those community policy interests are, drawing a physical map on how what that looks like, and then using that to advocate for maps that work for you. So one of the things that I want to talk about, I'll tell you what I'll do is I'm going to share. Bear with me a moment. What I'm showing you is called Districtor. This is when I talk about drawing maps, and I'm just going to show enough here to hopefully not scare you away. This is a free online software. It's very easy to use. This is the tool, and we've got training that's available. We've got support available. And I'm working on a script on how to use this within our campaign to make sure we all do this the same way and use everything that's produced. This is coming out of the Tufts University redistricting lab. It's the really great support out of that university for this. It's one of several different free online redistricting packages. What I want to do is show you how this is used, and just briefly, all 50 states are set up in this, and it shows you Minnesota. And what I've already done is I've worked with them because we've got specific interest in Olmsted County. They've already given us a map for Olmsted County, and we've already got a map for Rochester, so we can go ahead and draw districts in those two areas. What they do is they'll superimpose boundaries for the existing jurisdiction, so we can work on that. But if you look at Minnesota as a whole, you got two options: drawing districts or drawing communities. We want people to focus on drawing communities. And what we'll do is just briefly, and I'll show you how easy this is going down and it's pulling up for Minnesota, and I can drill right into your area. And this then draws in lines. And this gives us a map, and it has a lot of specific landmarks. You can add landmarks, and you can, based on discussions with people that or in groups, you can create maps. And those are all census block groups. That's the level it goes to right now. But it gives you the ability to start drawing those blocks to define what the maps could be based on what your communities are. And it's pretty simple to do that. So I can just color a group one there. And it's a little intimidating. We see somebody clicking on stuff, but it really is something that there's a process for talking about what's important, where do people live, what defines your community, like schools, activity centers, grocery stores, what's important in that area. Again, you see how it's easy it is for you to get in there, and it's easy just to erase stuff and start back over again. So, we have the whole state. We can map more of the state into, counties. If there's a lot of interest in Wright County, for example, I can ask them to create Wright County. we can provide some training and get you set up with that. The same thing if you're looking to do this for input to the legislature, you can still draw those community maps in the areas you want, and then provide those to the legislators, and you don't have to worry about trying to draw the whole district for them. So I'll just leave that where it is right now and go back to the slides. So think about if you're working on local redistricting, cities and counties, my advice is to start early, start reaching out now. Even though this doesn't happen until early next year, if there's going to be provision for criteria, if there's going to be a process for public input, and now's a good time to start asking a question to get them thinking about it, getting them interested, let them know you're interested. If you want to have like a website or some feature function to provide public input, then again, it's an opportunity to do that. You can ask whether criteria established or approved, what's their process, and that kind of thing. And one of the things I say here is assume they haven't thought about it. Again, this is something that happens once every 10 years, depending on what the turnover is in county commissioners. They may not have ever done it before. And I've talked to some cities and they've had enough turnover in the city council that nobody in the city council has ever done it. Now that's an opportunity for education and for collaboration. And again, it's something they think that, it's going to come along. It's going to be a quick, just even up the lines and move on. It's an opportunity for greater civic engagement and civic awareness than they may have considered. Absolutely attend county commission and city council meetings where appropriate related to redistricting. I found out that the city of Minneapolis has already started talking about redistricting. They have got a much more evolved and developed process, but they're already talking about it. So, your county commissioner probably hasn't thought about it yet, but when they start talking about it, go to the meetings, be visible, make sure they know that you're interested and you care, because like a lot of things, elected officials will focus on things that people care about. And then consider literacy editor on the need for transparency and public input. One of the things I really want people to think about is creating the right behaviors and the right attitudes around redistricting and public involvement and public engagement, and not waiting until things go bad. And when I say things go bad, I'm talking like Wisconsin or Michigan or North Carolina. In Wisconsin, I want to say the majority of the counties in Wisconsin have all passed no gerrymandering pledges, which is all the counties those counties, most of them have signed either resolutions or something out of nature saying that they pledge to work on fair maps with public involvement. They've got a big problem at the state level with district lines, but they're working the public and our people in Wisconsin are working at the local level to make a difference in what those attitudes are. So this is an opportunity to reinforce the democratic process in the local area. And I talked last week about options, but I want to emphasize the last one on this is local maps, engaging local elected officials on preparation structure for local redistricting and defining those community of interest maps to present to elected officials. Those are some local things you can do to impact how services and policies are made in Wright County, and then provide input to legislators on what those maps look like at the state level. So that's what I have. It's not a lot. I mean, certainly we can go into more, but what I want to do is provide an opportunity for questions and then whatever other information you'd like.
Okay, we've got
I'll
a
turn
number
it
of
back.
questions, and let me scroll back here and see if I can find the first one. Was from Greg, and he asks, wasn't Greg, where did he go? Here he is. Greg asks, redistricting can be a sort of Russian roulette version of term limits. How much does redistricting ever consider the residential location of incumbents?
Boy, that's a great question. Generally in county redistricting in Minnesota, they make a point not to draw. Let me think how to say this. I know state redistricting, when they do it, they intentionally don't draw the lines to leave somebody outside a district, because there's a term for that. I'm trying to remember what the term is, but they try not to do that. And just because it's disruptive. Now, on the other hand, there is provision in the law that if district lines are drawn such that a commissioner is no longer in a district that they're supposed to be in, and that did happen in a county, I won't say the name, but there was a county I talked to somebody and they said that the lines are redrawn to leave somebody out of their district. It's not illegal, but it's generally not done. And I just would leave it at that.
Beth asks a related question. Will county redistricting cause new county commissioner elections?
It can. If I'm trying to think about this, I think as long as the county commissioners are still in their same seats, they don't have to run for reelection. I'm thinking about this. Yeah, state senators all have to run for reelection. That's the one thing with the state level, though, with the legislature, is they all have to run again. So, 2022, everybody's going to run again, state senators and representatives, because they're going to redraw the Senate districts. But the county commissioners don't have to rerun as long as they're still in the district.
Okay, Sandra asks, you refer to guidance from the state, speaking of county redistricting.
Yep. I'll put a link in the chat for that. There is a document. It's a 2011 document. And what it has is bear with me. Yeah, that is, and actually that might be my file. I'll get the link in the chat. There is a 2011 redistricting document from the state that is basically is developed to support the local governments and state government and how to do redistricting. It takes what's in statute and boils it down into plain English. It has all the statutory references in it. Yeah, and I'll get you that into the link. So that, yeah, give me 1 second here. There we go. Yeah, and I put my email address there as well. So that guideline, if you click on that link to that guideline, that was in 2011. I've talked to the state. They are redoing that. Most of those laws haven't changed. What it goes through is it goes through each part of the state law about redistricting. It will give you the statute. It'll also give some suggestions on things that could be done that aren't required. So I think it's pretty useful. It's well written. Can you hear me?
Are you ready for the next question?
Yes, I am.
Okay, sorry. This is from Sonia, who says, do we ask the county commissioner board what software they use to assist them? Is the information in the software they use public data?
Great question. I think you should ask them how they're going to do it. And just ask the open-ended question because they may not have thought about it. Before I was reading some of the history recently, I think 1990 was the first year they actually used software to do it, do redistricting. Before that, it was all pencil and paper. And yeah, I have no idea how they do it. I think you just ought to ask them. And if they do it, I don't know if the software is public information, but the maps are certainly public information. And I know at the state level, they do it in Maptitude, which is the software that we're using. And all the files that come out of Maptitude to the state level are public information.
Okay. Mary asks, how is our maps related to the COI maps? I just lost the question. The COI maps we make.
When you say that, I'm just trying to, you're talking about when you talk about our maps. Oh, okay. Our maps. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. I'm going to go kind of from a high level down to a lower level. There's the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy, which Indivisible is a part of that. Claire MacGyver's representative to that organization from Indivisible. And so is League of Women Voters, and I participate there. And then you go down from that, the Our Maps Minnesota campaign is the redistricting campaign of the the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy. Minnesota Alliance for Democracy is a democracy alliance that has a number of specific interests with regards to democracy issues, money in politics, and things of that nature, including redistricting. So the Our Maps Minnesota campaign is the specific campaign focused on redistricting. Now that within that, we've got a lot of structure, we've got a lot of activities because it's something we're very focused on with some goals and objectives in the next year. So the community of interest maps is what we're working with groups such as Indivisible and local League of Women Voters leagues and other groups to create maps that then can be brought together and presented to legislators, or they can be brought into the Parallel Commission and then develop a state level map. So the Our Maps Minnesota campaign is a campaign of the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy. The community of interest maps is an activity of the Our Maps Minnesota campaign.
Okay, Sonia asks, when does this software load the new population data?
It will load it in September when we get it from the Census Bureau. Yeah, the people at Tufts University are very tied in with the Census Bureau. Dr. Moon Dutchin is the faculty there who's heading this up from the university. She works quite closely with the Census Bureau and statistical group. She's a mathematician actually, but for mathematicians, she has a very strong community orientation. A lot of these software systems have a very analytical, statistical approach, but they really look at, and I think rightfully, as a community focus on how we pull the maps together and using the mathematical modeling to help support that and that function.
Marcia asks, how are census blocks determined?
The census blocks are determined, that's a geographic representation that the Census Bureau does. And they actually have produced the census blocks for the 2020 census. There's tracks, there's blocks, and there's block groups. And the block groups, I want to say, are like 6,000 people, roughly 3,000 to 6,000 people in a block group. And so those block maps were produced here in February, but that doesn't mean that they've got the population data. The population data takes longer to validate and refine, but they've got those maps. That comes from the Census Bureau.
Okay, Pat asks, nice map builder, but who built and created the underlining data? Like what communities are assigned to my block?
Right, and then what you see in the lines, and what I'll do is go back here. Um, if we go down, each one of these is a block group. Each square, when I point at that. So that's a block group. This is using census data for the block groups. It's using geographic data from the GIS, which everybody, all the different governmental organizations, educational organizations shares the same geographic information service data. So this is not something that is created by somebody outside of the Minnesota state. Minnesota state is really good at pulling data together, population data, geographic data, in order to feed into these. So this is coming from Minnesota state data and census data. It's not coming from something else.
Okay. Oh, pardon me. I'm losing my, here we go. Let's see here. Lee asks, which courts would make a final determination for local redistricting if necessary?
All right, and then here's the avenue. There is in statute provision for challenging county commissioner districts. And so you can challenge in court. And this actually came up in a presentation I was doing a couple of weeks ago. So this, if you challenge the district lines, commissioner district lines in court and win, that's generally done in state district court, is where you challenge that. If the district court rules in favor of the voters, and then the county commissioners are required to establish an independent commission to draw the district lines. Now, the question that was asked me a couple of weeks ago was, okay, well, who pays? Well, here's the thing. Initially, the people filing a lawsuit will pay. Now, if you win, and this applies also for people who file suit in state court for state level maps, if you win your lawsuit or you're successful in having the courts draw lines or overrule what the county has done or the state has done, then there's a provision in the Secretary of State's office to reimburse your legal costs. So if you file suit and win, your costs will be reimbursed.
Okay. Judy asks, what determines the number of commissioners for each county? Census?
The county commissioners. And there's a provision, and in that link I gave you, there's a section in there that talks about changing the number of county commissioners. And we had this discussion, I'm trying to remember which county it was. It was Dakota County. And they were talking about, they've got 5 commissioners, they're talking about going to 7 commissioners. But the county commissioner said, well, we think we can handle it. No, it was, I'll take it back, it was Washington County. The county commissioner said, we got 5, we think we handle it with 5. But it's up to the county commissioners whether they go from 5 to 7 or 3 to 5, wherever they are. And normally they do that at the same time as the decennial redistricting, because if you go change the number of commissioners, you have to redistrict.
Beth asks if you can put your contact info, your email, in the chat.
Yep, and I did put that up there. So phuffman@lwvmn.org.
Okay, Sonia wants to know, where did Sonia go? Hang on. Do we ask them point blank who is taking the lead?
I would start with just asking what the process is, because again, assume that they haven't thought about it, haven't done it, and then they should be responsive. What happened with me was I reached out to my county commissioner, and she directed me right to the county administrator. And so I had some discussion with the county administrator, because my county commissioner, I don't think was a county commissioner 10 years ago. She didn't know. The county administrator is the one who kind of facilitated the process 10 years ago. So he was actually a source of a lot of good information about how it was done. And so that was a good starting point, but it is something to then get some information and circle back and look for other opportunities to engage your county commissioner on, hey, I heard this is how we're going to do it, or I heard we didn't do this last time, and have you thought about this? I'm a big fan of starting with a collaborative kind of engagement with elected officials. Assume they don't know, assume they haven't thought about it, lay it out there, ask them the open-ended question, and then see where that goes and how they respond.
Sally wants to know, our town is elected at large. What is the advantage of being divided into wards? When should we?
That's a great question. The in the way that reference manual is written, it said 9 of the 10 largest cities in the state are in wards. Well, that's outdated because 2 of the 8th and 9th largest cities in the state are Maple Grove and Woodbury, and neither one are divided into wards. And I can tell you that Woodbury, which is where I live, is gone. I don't know what they were 10 years ago. I was here 10 years ago. I think we're now around probably 75,000, 77,000 people. And we've got enough difference in the nature of the parts of the city. For example, there's a part of the city of Woodbury that's on the west side of I-494, South I-94. That has actually got quite a bit of apartments, some affordable housing. It's more diverse than some of the earlier areas. I've looked at the addresses for our city council members. They all live within about a 1.5 mile radius, kind of the south central side of Woodbury. And they tend toward a certain demographic, and they aren't necessarily representative of the whole city. And so we're going into a discussion right now about the Gold Line, which is a proposed rapid bus transit to go to Woodbury from St. Paul. Well, that is something that maybe the people from South Central Woodbury aren't very, in favor of, but there's a number of other people who probably would be in favor of that, who either commute to work in St. Paul or people who don't have cars and need transit options. So when you get to a certain size and there's enough diversity in the population and the policy interests of your city, that you would be better served with wards, so you get a diversity of voices, because we in Woodbury frankly don't have a diversity of voices right now. And I've been kind of exploring a little bit, what would it take to go to wards, and I've talked to some people who've done that elsewhere, and it's a real battle, because you basically have to get the city council to agree to do it without because it's not necessarily an advantage. It's more work, it's a little more complicated, but it does provide for better representation and does provide for more diverse voices.
Marcia wants to know, where can we find a list of Alliance for Democracy member organizations?
That's a great question. And that's something, if you know, the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy, Anastasia Belladonna Carrera is the executive. She's kind of the lead of that group. We are working through right now on getting on the website logos for the groups that are involved with that. So we just had a call on Monday. So I don't think there is a single list right now of the groups that are partners or involved in that. We're working to get that, have more transparency, because we think if we want transparency from other groups, we ought to be modeling that transparency as well. So that's something we're in the process of doing.
Pat has a follow-up question from a little bit earlier. It says, is the data that is input to the map software public information?
Yes. I mean, it's public information. If you've got the technical ability to download the data files from the Census Bureau and get the GIS files from the state, and you could do it, you could create it yourself. I mean, that's how these folks at Tufts University did it. There's a thing called Dave's Redistricting app, which is something that's been out there for probably 20 years. And it's just a bunch of people. It's crowdfunded. It's basically, a free software, and these folks developed it just because they were interested. And I actually have talked to people who developed their own redistricting software, and you can go get all the data yourself. But you've got to be really smart with computers and really smart with data and data sets and files to do it.
Sonia asks, if needed, how do you find a lawyer to contest?
I think if you were to approach one of the nonprofit democracy groups, we could probably give you some help with people to talk to. I mean, there's firms from League of Women Voters. We've filed some lawsuits here in the last year, which I think we're really well placed. And there's some specific law firms that have expertise in election law that have some expertise in that. So I think that would be my suggestion, is talk to, Nick Harper, who's our civic engagement director, is an attorney who specializes in election law, and he knows a lot of those other attorneys.
Pat asks, you talked about mapping via community of interest. How do we discover what was assigned to my block and by who?
When you say assigned to your block, you're talking about like the census block?
Pat, do you want
If
to
you're talking
unmute
to-
yourself and answer
Yeah.
that, Paul?
Yes, I'm sorry. It's really about who decided that data. In other words, I don't know, communities of interest could be about anything. I mean, I saw some of your examples that you talked about, so I could say, I could make up something that I call a community of interest. Now, if you're going to do that, you now have to assign people that you think belong to that community of interest in order to determine populations, right? So if,
Right.
So my community of interest was mining. So do I just take the whole Northeast and say that must be that community of interest, or how do we do that?
Well, that's a great question, Pat. Yeah, I mean, and part of the point is to define a community of interest, you have to involve that community. So you have to talk to people from the community. And this means going out and talking to people. This is part of what we think the legislature or an independent redistricting commission ought to do is, and this is what's required in a number of states, is that they have to go meet with people in different parts of the state to ask them, hey, what's important to you about how these districts are drawn? And so then if a group of people, for example, from Northeast Minnesota, they were to say that they would say, hey, in this area, this is where we as a community are from. We've talked to other people who are part of our network, and we all think that this certain geographic area is the area that has the mining interest. And then that would be the input to the maps. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody in that area is doing mining, but it means that the people who do mining are predominantly in that area, and that's the geographic area that they're in. And they would like to ensure that they have effective representation through the way the maps are drawn. So it's not somebody sitting in a room deciding what people's community of interest is, because that's kind of what the legislature does. They go sit in a back room and they'll talk, or they'll think about it, or they'll have political consultants go do stuff and bring it to them. This is where you actually go to the people, and the people say, hey, here's what we think our communities are. Here's where we think these areas that need to be represented and maintained together because of the commonality of interest. And then give that to the legislatures to put into the maps. Does that kind of answer the question?
It does. It's just a slippery slope on who decides what for an area. I mean, it's not as black and white as things like census data and GIS maps.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's why people love the data, because the data is clear. At the same time, I mean, ethnic groups aren't monolithic. And so, then that's why, saying that everybody of a certain group or another thinks the same way. Well, everybody who lives in a certain area in Northeast Minnesota isn't all into mining. Some of them are, mining is very important. Some of it is natural resources, very important. So then it's a matter of weighing those different policy choices. It's harder, but it also makes sure, and I talked last week about some examples where if communities are divided up, one of them I didn't talk about is a great example is in South Central LA. If you go back to the early 90s, I used to live in Southern California, and I had left there just like a year before the riots after Rodney King in the early 90s. One of the areas that was particularly hard hit in the rioting was Koreatown. Well, it turned out Koreatown was split up between 3 different congressional districts and 5 different legislative districts in California. So they could not find anybody who'd take a significant interest in what their problems were, because they didn't have consistent representation. So that was an area with specific economic and cultural interests that nobody recognized as a community that warranted a specific voice. And that impacted significantly our ability to get support. So there's other kind of examples like that.
Paul, I just think I can speak for everybody. I'm so impressed with the amount of information that you have and that you can retrieve via your brain or your computer. This has been amazing. It seems like we've gone all over the place. Right now, there are no more questions in the box, and we do have about 20 minutes left. Is there anything you would like to say?
No, no, thanks, Susan. First of all, I apologize for my little technical difficulties. I got to buy a new router, but just have to get some time. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk. The next step, if people are interested in doing doing something more, is, let me know. We can connect you with some training on mapping or training on how to do community of interest mapping. Or if you're interested in, do something where you engage with the legislature, let me know. We'll find a way to get you involved or get you information. But it really then comes to taking some action. And again, I think that the reach out to legislators, and I think I shared last week some talking points for elected officials. And I can send that again. There's a list of things to talk to, and it's just reaching out to elected officials. And with the legislature right now, if you're reaching out to the legislators, say, where are you on redistricting with the House? They haven't had any meetings yet. And so are they going to have any meetings, or what are they doing? If the legislators tell you we're waiting for census data, that's a bunch of hooey. Okay, there's a lot of things they can do without the census data, census block data. They can be talking about criteria, which the Senate is already talking about criteria. We don't necessarily agree with their criteria, but at least they're doing it. They can talk about process. They can take public input. They can create mechanisms for the public to provide input on maps, like 28 other states do, and Minnesota does not. There's a lot of things the legislature can do. And I showed last week that there's the maps that show how the changes in distribution of population have gone. And that provides enough information to start speculating on what should those maps look like. And so there's already enough information there for the legislature to be doing some work. And if they're saying I can't do anything until the census block data comes in September, they're really just putting you off. That's what they're doing. And so it's a matter of just kind of, again, I'm not from Minnesota originally, but I like to be polite, give people the benefit of the doubt, and just kind of, to me, it's like the power of water. Grand Canyon was formed by the power of water. Steady, consistent pressure over a long period of time. Just don't go away. Be persistent. Keep asking, and then just keep on them, and let them know what's important. And that's what I'd say. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to make a difference in the principles for democracy, for making an impact on redistricting, and really making this issue and this situation visible to elected officials.
We did get one more question. Do we ask these of both our House and Senate reps?
Yes. Yeah, ask them where they are. And even if they're not on the committee, because that's another thing they may tell you, well, I'm not on the committee. Well, there's a lot of people not on the committee. But that doesn't mean they can't have input to the committee and talk to the people, because I know my state rep fairly well. And he's not on the committee, but he's talked to people he knows on the committee. Matter of fact, he shares a legislative assistant with Representative Murphy, who is the chair of the House Redistricting Committee. So that helps. But they can talk to people on the committee. They can have input. It's a matter of who is providing the energy and the information to them, and establishing some of that accountability.
Okay. There was a question about the video from last week, March 8th, whatever that day was, and tonight. I will be sending out tomorrow. I'll be sending it out to Wright County members and also to Clara. So she will pass it on to you also. This has been a great presentation. Clara, did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or that you want to remind people of?
Well, I've dropped in a couple of times an invitation to Indivisible MN03 is having a meeting tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And we have a super duper person from headquarters of Indivisible in Washington, D.C., the director of democracy policy. who would kind of let us know all the big things that we'd like to accomplish between now and the end of the year before we get caught up into another election cycle. So anyone that's interested that there's a Facebook link to the event if you'd like to come. That would be great. We would appreciate that. Now back to redistricting. Paul, do you have actual districtor training sessions set up yet, or is that a future thing?
No, we've been having districtor training since late January. There still is some training yet in March, every Monday and Wednesday. And I can put the link in the chat here momentarily. But there is training available.
Okay, great. I know I was signed up for some sort of districtor training and my equipment failed me and I didn't get to go to it. So I'm looking for getting back into that. Then now say one of our groups like Wright County or Plymouth wanted to pursue further, we could ask for our own trainings and then go out in our own community and you know, like
Yes.
become local experts.
Yeah. Yeah, and districtor training is it's group training. There's a kind of introductory level, which is I put the link in the chat for that if you want to see their flyer. The dates go through March, and they had told me they're going to go through April, and they're still sorting out getting the April dates. There is some additional training we have through the Our Maps Minnesota campaign under the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy that we did a video, and we've got some people who are trained and that can do some support for you on that. And we are doing some mapping workshops. I'm doing them with local leagues and League of Women Voters, but we'll include whoever, and we'll do, if you get some people who are interested in learning more, we will work with you to set something up.
Okay, that sounds great. And I think last week you said something to the effect of many of us at the state level will not particularly suffer, but there are certain communities that we might need to like be allies or support in some way. Could you maybe
Right.
say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, and this is the way I look at this is that you know that really the focus on this is to enable support underrepresented and underheard communities, and so if I just being frank, for myself, policies that may be exclusionary or regressive, I mean, that it's going to work to my benefit, and I recognize that. So really this is about ensuring representation, equity in our society, and that policies reflect all of the voices in our society, not just those that are maybe the loudest or maybe the most privileged or the best educated. So I think it's important that we have representation for everybody. And that's something we can do. We can enable support and provide opportunity for that and ensure that the process is set up. Because just for this group, what I'll say is that for BIPOC community colors, they've got a lot of things that are priorities to them with social justice issues, economic issues, employment issues, housing. And those are all, I think, I believe, and I think there's sufficient evidence to say that's a product of the social structure and the political structure we've had in place. In order to ensure greater equity and representation and in policy, we've got to have a process that gives voice to those other communities. And so that's part of what this is about. It's not about me, it's about democracy. And democracy isn't always about what's good for me, it's what's good for the whole. And I think we got to look at what's good for the whole.
Excellent
Okay.
words to end on. Appreciate your time tonight again, Paul, and for everybody coming at this point in time. I think we'll close our meeting and everyone have a good evening. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
All right, thanks
Susan.
very much.
You.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, thanks, Clara.